In the early 1950s, in Dallas, Texas, there's a woman named Beth Nesmith Graham who's on the verge of a breakthrough, but she doesn't know it. She's a single mother. She's got one child, divorced after World War II, and she's working at Texas Bank and Trust. Like most secretaries in that era, she's madly frustrated by her new IBM electric typewriter. Anybody know why? The carbon ribbon is always smudging her pages. And it's a nightmare trying to erase or trying to reprint. It's absolutely maddening. But I said she's on the verge of a breakthrough. Unlike many of the secretaries of that era, she also had to take a second and third job to support her single family. So one weekend she was working as a painter, painting windows in an advertising display at the bank. And she made a mistake, and she started frantically trying to erase her mistake. And the painter stopped her and said, whoa, 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 what are you doing? What are you doing? And she said, I'm trying to fix this mistake. And he said, hang on. Painters don't erase, painters paint over their mistakes. Immediately she thought about her IBM typewriter, and she had an idea. This is the question that has obsessed me for the last 12 years as I've been at Stanford University. How do breakthroughs happen? Most people, if you were to ask them, do you want less breakthroughs in your life? They would say, definitely not. They want more breakthroughs. And yet, if you think about how most people approach breakthroughs, what they're doing is they're waiting haphazardly as victims. They're basically just a victim. They aren't thinking proactively about perpetrating a breakthrough. They have no ability or no sequence of thought that would enable them to actually seek out a breakthrough. And as I have been considering this question, as I've been under this quest, what I've discovered is it comes down to a profound misunderstanding of what it means to be creative, and profound misunderstanding even of what an idea is. I'd like to ask you a very simple question. What is an idea? If a kindergartner asked you, and you had to explain it to a kindergartner, what would you say? How would you describe an idea? It's a very, very simple question, and yet, for most of you, you go, hang on, the answer's not quite so simple. And yet, if you think about what does it take to get to a breakthrough, an idea is the fundamental unit of a breakthrough, and we can't even define it. And if we can't define it, how can we possibly hope to make progress actually breaking through and to change the paradigm from being a victim of a breakthrough to being a perpetrator of a breakthrough? Here's the simplest way that I can describe it based on my admittedly layman's understanding of the underlying neuroscience. An idea is a connection. Very simply stated. You think about Beth Nesmith Graham there working at the window. She had this Lego, you can almost picture it, of her problem with the IBM typewriter. And then when the painter said painters don't erase, they paint over their mistakes, it's like another Lego just clicked into place. It's a connection. And you might think that's an overly simplistic description of the way things work. It's not. That's how breakthroughs happen. A team here in your cohort has been wrestling with this question of how do we alleviate range anxiety among electric vehicle owners? They've got a Lego. One of the engineers all of a sudden was reminded of something he saw in the military. Jet fighters can't carry much fuel, right? But you know what happens? They get a mid-air refueling. I know what just happened in your mind. You just had an idea, right? I haven't even told you what the team does. But what happened? You took one Lego and another Lego, and you put them together, and in your mind, the way it struck you was, I have an idea. That's all an idea is. It's a connection between two places in your brain. The human brain is incapable of creating new material from scratch. An idea is a connection between things that hadn't been connected before that seems new to you. I got a friend who has a stroller company in San Francisco, and he's trying to figure out how to get in amongst the well-heeled elite of Silicon Valley. But you know what sucks about baby strollers in San Francisco? The hills. Nobody wants to push a baby stroller up hills in San Francisco. And he's sitting there talking about how frustrating it is. He can't break into the market. And then he remembered, almost offhandedly, his experience that he had when he was a teenager mowing lawns. And he remembered how transformative it was when he was able to save up enough to buy a self-propelled lawnmower. You see what just happened for you? Yes. Idea, right? All it was, I'm just giving you Lego pieces. But for you, in your experience, you're having ideas, right? This is what's happening in your brain. And you might think, okay, it's all well and good to know that an idea is just a connection. What's the practical value? Well, I would argue there's actually immense practical value. We've got a graduate student at Stanford who's an incredibly enterprising engineer, who's very entrepreneurial, who's always trying to come up with new ideas. And he pulled me aside after class the other day and said, Jeremy, you have no idea how relieving it is to know that an idea is just a connection. He said, I've been trying to come up with ideas, but like they're these amorphous, slippery things. I don't really know if I've had one. And when I realize all I need to be doing is seeking out connections, it makes it practical. I know what to do. And there's all sorts of tools that we can teach you for how to come up with connections. Perry and I, who's here, Perry Claybon, a co-professor with me at Stanford, he and I are writing a book about many of the tactics that you can employ to seek out new connections deliberately and to seek out unexpected input deliberately. We can share a sample chapter of that book with you if you'd like. We'd be happy to do so. But the point is, it's very important to understand what an idea actually is. Some Danish researchers did a study that was undertaking how to demonstrate someone's ability to be more creative. And they had a creativity training that they wanted to do. So they took a control group of people who had no training whatsoever and tried to assess their creativity. And then they took a second group of people and gave them a training. And then unexpectedly, they took a third group of people and gave them the training and then taught them the underlying neuroscience of what's actually happening in their brains. Hopefully it won't surprise you now that you've heard this to realize those people who had neuroscience training were proven to be way more creative than counterparts that were just taught creative thinking. There is immense value in understanding what's happening in your brain. So, a new idea is just a connection. And there are ways that you can seek new connections out, unexpected input out, just like Beth Nesmith Graham, just like the team that's doing mid-air refueling for EVs, just like my friend who's doing self-propelled baby strollers for the streets of San Francisco. You can seek out unexpected inputs as well. But I'm not going to talk about those tactics. The only thing I want to mention today is what's in your head that keeps you from making those new connections. Just like an idea is a connection, unexpected, between two parts of your brain, what keeps you from ideas is also in your brain. There's two key cognitive barriers that I want to mention because they have a profound impact on your ability to make new connections. The first cognitive barrier is what's known as a longing for cognitive closure. You may or may not be aware of this, but one of the most distressing phenomena that the human brain can experience is unresolved questions. So where are we going for dinner tonight? I don't even care. It could be Johnny Carino's, it could be Macaroni Gardens. Just let's decide and move on, right? What should we do next quarter for our major product introduction? We treat that same question like it's a question where we're going for dinner tonight. We want to answer it as quickly as possible. You think about how do you get your kids to eat vegetables? Again, the tendency is to come up with as few ideas as quickly as possible to resolve the uncertainty that our brains hate. Most research suggests that many brainstorms never get past 2 ideas. I don't know if you have more experience with that or different experience in your organization. Our observations in most organizations really reinforce that observation. And you can start to understand why. When you appreciate the fact that the human brain despises uncertainty, you can understand why we don't generate that much material. Because you know what's happening? Everybody's going, I really like what Jennifer said. Let's just do that. And then we're good, right? There's no more problem, right? right about the same time that Bette Nesmith Graham was inventing what would become liquid paper, a company which 20 years later she would sell for $200 million to Gillette. Right about that same time, a World War II spy named Donald McKinnon was undertaking one of the most famous studies of creativity that's ever been conducted. And Donald McKinnon was interested in knowing, what does practical creativity look like? What does it mean? How do you accomplish it? And he didn't want to deal with the arts because that's too, loosey-goosey. So he went to architects. He said, there's an interesting area where you've got to be creative, but you also have to be practical. I want to understand what distinguishes the most creative architects from the rest. And he undertook a longitudinal study. One of the most fascinating findings of his study was that the most creative architects in the field delayed decisions. They were procrastinators. Famously, Frank Lloyd Wright, who developed one of the most famous residential developments of the 20th century, a development called Fallingwater, had a contract in place, did nothing, never approached the drafting board, and the client called saying, I'm on my way, I'll be there in 2 hours. And he approached the drafting table for the first time and banged out what was Fallingwater. This is maddening to most people who hope that our progress kind of is perfectly plotted with time. Because what often happens for creative people is there's what looks like a period of hibernation, or you could call it gestation. But what creative individuals know is that gestation period is actually essential to incubating ideas. And it makes sense, right? The longer you wait to make a decision, the more information you expose yourself to, the more inspiration you open yourself up to, the better the potential outcomes are. And so it's so counterintuitive because we want to just figure out the answer. We want to just resolve it. But one of the most important things you can do if an outcome really matters to you is wait to decide. Just like Frank Lloyd Wright, it's rumored that Martin Luther King did not finish his speech until he was sitting on the White House Mall. And he scrawled, I have a dream, in the margin of his speech. It wasn't a part of his prepared remarks. But because he allowed himself to delay and to wait, he allowed himself to remain open to the breakthrough ideas that ultimately changed the course of history. Okay, so the first cognitive bias is a longing to seek closure as quickly as possible. But the second cognitive bias is related, and it's just as insidious. And it's this orientation towards quality. So I'll tell you a personal anecdote because I think it will help you. Many times people say, hey, what do you do at Stanford? And I say, I teach people how to come up with ideas. I always get the same response. Do you know what it is? I tested this, by the way, in a large graduate student class the other day. So I said, I want to make sure this is true. One of my grad students verbatim raised her hand and said exactly the response I always get. I say I teach people how to come up with ideas, and everyone says, how do you come up with a good idea? Always. You see the difference there? I didn't say anything about good. And I said ideas, plural. But everyone, when they hear this thought of how do you come up with ideas, thinks, how do you come up with a single good idea? And this orientation towards quality is actually an incredible hindrance to creativity. The research suggests that the single greatest variable impacting the quality of your outputs is actually what? The quantity of your outputs. So if you want better ideas, you know what research suggests? You need more ideas. And again, you might think that's a semantic difference, right? Actually, no. The way you approach the challenge of coming up with better ideas is fundamentally different than the way you approach the challenge of coming up with more ideas. And this cognitive bias has profound implications on how we interact with collaborators and how we seek out inspiration and how long we allow ourselves time to discover. So I want to close with a simple graph. I think it'll really help drill home the point. If you think about most ideas being distributed over a normal distribution, this is true. You can think about the quality of your ideas as something like this. Most of your ideas are average ideas. Very few of your ideas are truly genius ideas. No offense. And very few of your ideas are downright goofy. Okay? But here's the thing. Most people say, I don't want to deal with the goofy stuff. I'd like to limit the distribution. I want to cut off the left tail of the distribution. And what they don't realize is it's a variance game. It's a volume and variance game. And if you cut off the left-hand side of the distribution, you also cut off the right-hand side of the distribution. And by refusing to allow yourself to come up with the goofy, you also severely limit your ability to come up with the genius. And so instead of reducing your left-hand side distribution, what you've got to do is create an environment where we're actually reducing the floor here. We're generating more volume underneath the entire graph, knowing that we're never going to move forward with something stupid, but allowing stupid stuff to emerge is the only thing to get to the truly breakthrough material. So it has profound implications for how you interact as a team, the kind of psychological safety you need to develop. To get to genius, you've got to embrace goofiness. There's a lot more techniques that we could share with you all. As I said, I've not tried to establish many of the techniques. We can share some links and resources to download sample chapters and even engage in a little micro-learning lesson that one of our graduates created to reinforce some of these principles. That's pretty fun. But today what we wanted to do is just share a little bit of the cognitive underpinning. What matters is seeking out connections, delaying your decisions, and focusing on generating volume, allowing quality to care for itself. Quality will look after itself. Okay, so you're about to see some amazing breakthroughs. The same breakthroughs follow this same curve. And what we'd invite you to dig into at the Founders is not just what are their genius ideas, but what are all of the things that they've tried that haven't worked because they've been learning and trying to get to this part of the distribution. And we're really excited to share them with you.